Hello, 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 everyone. Hello, hello, hello. Uh, I don't know how many people are going to be able to show up today. I'm just going to wait for everyone to come in. In the meantime, oh, yes, by the way, Louisa is not going to be able to make it. Unfortunately, she has the flu. She's currently in bed. I don't because of my superior white European genes. Or it would have been nice, speaking about a Japanese book, to actually have a Japanese person with a bit of insight. However, it's just going to have to be us straight white men, excluding one or two of us here. However, hi everyone. I hope. Look at this already. Us. Look at this already. Us. I'm not. You know what? I'm gonna be the bigger person and move forward. While we're just waiting for everyone to come in, I will respond. Leo, you asked a question, but I don't think it's appropriate to start off with that. I will mention it later. Um, Esteban, you're in our go-to recorder. Are you okay to record again? Okay, cool. Moving on from all this terrible racial talk, we're going to speak about The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Mishima. Now, it's quite a short novel, and we can just speak about it, see how things go, because if we want, we can just summarize the novel, talk about it, and if there's time after, we can just do like a casual hangout and everything and just shoot the shit with one another. But in the meantime, I would like to have the stage for someone to come because I have a lot of topics that I would like to approach this novel from, and I don't want to lead the charge and immediately start talking about Mishima or the book in a very specific way. I would like if someone wants to kickstart just about what their general consensus was with the book, or if it's their first exposure to Mishima, or if it's their first exposure to the novel, just a general opinion of what someone had with reading it. Bear in mind, I have never used this before, so I'm going to see the request. Oh yeah, you need to request in order to come on the stage. I think, I don't know, I might be completely wrong with that. But if anyone wants to take over, or if anyone wants to jump on the stage, do let me know. If not, I can just carry on. Leo, you're here. Take it, my friend.
Okay. So, I was amazed by the book because I thought it was a completely different story than what. By the time I started reading about the themes and like what is about and Mishima's life, I was like, wait, he took the perspective of Noboru because, like, I swear to God, I thought this book was just like, I thought it was very squarely a book about youth idolatry and like the kind of delusions of youth. That's what I thought it was. I thought it was just a story about like this kid who we could talk about spoilers at this point, right? We could all talk
Yeah,
about
yeah, yeah,
spoilers.
yeah.
Okay. So I just thought it was about like this kid who had a fucked up idea of maturity, and there was this guy who lived through all that, and you know he sees something else in life, and it's just their conflict, and he ultimately gets screwed over by the kid, and like that all fits well. But by the time I start reading about the themes, and I also knew a little bit about Mishima before the book, so I was expecting like reading through it that it was eventually going to take the perspective of Noboru, but I didn't realize it would take the perspective of Noboru so violently. I had to like reread the book to start like understanding it more, and I started reading it from the beginning, and I realized like Noboru's life is portrayed as very empty, like in the
Mm.
beginning. Like he really has this like chronic dissatisfaction, and that's all I know. I don't know where it's coming from, which is something I'd likely like to talk with you guys about. But yeah, it's just this. I straight up thought it was gonna be a, but it very seems to be much more about. If I'm correct, it's I guess it's a story about like a sailor who fell from grace with the sea, someone who fell from grace with their ultimate claim to power, will, and individuality, and you know because of that suffered. Because of that, he was capsized. So,
Mm.
but I don't know. I mean, like I'm still honestly generating a lot of thoughts on the book, just from thinking about it. I mean, just from like rethinking it. So that's basically my like coming into it so far. Well, what do you guys think?
I mean, I think it's quite interesting because I find that with Mishima's work, I've always said that he's the artist more than anyone in any medium, that I find it so difficult to detach his personal life from his work himself. And I think even in relation to his bibliography, I think this book, and we can get into details with it after, but on my, like, I've read this a couple of times and rereading it again, I feel as though more than ever, this book felt like a fantasy from Mishima himself. I don't know if anyone else felt that, but we're inevitably going to speak about how it relates to his desires and his personal life. But George, you also took the stage, so what have you got?
Hey, um, so yeah, you said right now that book is like a fantasy for Mishima, and it's
Hmm.
definitely like a strong heterosexual fantasy that he has on his life. Because when he was a little boy, he was like, from what I read, he was like not very strong. He got picked on by other boys. He had like an
Yeah,
abusive father, I think. I don't remember, but like it was tough for him. So like this like whole like persona of like a postmodern samurai getting buff and shit, but like still like being like a gay man. Like I can see all of those things like being like recombined and like
yeah.
translated into the book very much.
Yeah, I think that so for those that don't know about Mishima, I would be really interested as to someone's perspective reading his work, not knowing about him, because it seems almost impossible to detach him from it. And as you said, yeah, so for people that don't know, Mishima, he ended his life in a public suicide after this. I mean, the thing is that it appears as a coup in that he had these ardent followers who went to an embassy, took hostages, and then declared su- the supremacy of the Japanese emperor and this rallying cry for nationalism. Or it seemed so obvious that it wasn't going to work, and it resulted in him committing seppuku. And the thing about Mishima is that, and even when you read this book, there is such a connection between his eroticism of death and the human body, and particularly the human male body, this perfect body that is going to ultimately end. And there is this sexualization of it that occurs throughout the novel. But there is this idea, the idea of death being inflicted upon himself was a fetish for Mishima, and this is just a manner of which he explored it. Benicio, you came in, so what have you got to offer?
Hey, I just wanted first like to introduce myself because it's my first time like meeting you
Welcome.
guys or just hearing your voices.
It's,
I've
it's, it's a bit odd, isn't it?
it's super odd. Yes, yes. I'm super excited and also a little bit nervous because like
Oh,
you
don't worry.
speak English so fast and so much words. Might not be that eloquent. So yeah, but for me, it actually was the first time to read something by Mishima.
Hmm.
I've never seen something before. Just a few scenes from Paul Schrader's movie. I forgot its name. And so I have nothing to no context like of this person.
Oh, okay.
But for me, the book was kind of about ideology and what narratives you tell to yourself. Um, yeah, and I wanted to like hear what your perspectives are on this. If you felt the same way, if it's about ideology,
Hmm.
also.
Hmm. George, did you want to say something?
Yes, it's a thing. Like I just posted on the chat like this little quote: "Love is suicide." It's from a Smashing Pumpkins song, "Bodies." Nobody's ever knew, and like I'm thinking about like to love someone like the sailor Yuji. is that his name, right? Ryuji loved Fusako. Like he had like give up his identity as a like strong, independent man, as a sailor, to just be with the Fusako. And like, and at the beginning of the novel, what's my name? Noburu, he fucking idolized Ryuji to death. And was then he saw him just become like a shoreman. I think that's not the right word. Just become a man of the land for a woman, for his mom in particular. The male identity is a big part of this book, as I said before, in love.
Yeah. Well, I also think that there's like there also seems to be these weird parallels between Noboru and Ryuji in this. I mean, they're both these longing characters, and Noboru practices this idea of like absolute dispassionate lifestyle, like complete objectivity and the removal of any kind of. I mean, the reason that they sacrifice Ryuji at the end is because he's not a hero, because he's essentially a romantic type, and yet at the same time, we see in the rules that like Noburu's writing down of the reasons as to the crimes that Ryuji has committed. He has to erase some of them because he still has these emotions and these feelings towards him that are also imperfect within his ideology. But what I find interesting is that ultimately a lot of what we see, particularly in the first half of the story, is that Noboru, he really comes across as kind of like a sheltered little boy. I mean, in the sense that like he's fascinated with ships and these things, and like he's trying to teach his mum about them, and you know, like she's like just casually listening but not really listening. And Ryuji also has that same longing for the ocean and the sea that Noboru has. And I find it interesting that Noboru has such this rejection of Ryuji, and I don't know if it's whether that they are mirrors, they are parallels of one another, in that they are inevitably going to be unfulfilled. Like when the chief is teaching them that what is it that he says? It's something like, "We all know that the world is empty," and I believe that this is also Mishima's view, and that's also, it seems to be why he might feel as though he has a fatalist perspective that, yeah, of course the only solution is in life is to kill yourself, because there is such a dichotomy of being, you know, I am romantic, I do care about aesthetics. At the same time, I want to be an absolute man's man that is completely dispassionate, that's completely stoic. And so I'm always going to be longing for something. Why not just kill myself? Because surely that would be the greatest, the most glorifying thing that could happen to me as a man. If anyone else wants to take over as well, by all means.
It just sounds pretty death driven. I'm kind of curious as to like, what do you think is the nuance? What is the nuance other than like, to me, I don't know enough about Mishima, and that's why I'm not fully putting my eggs in any basket. But like, holy shit, this guy sounds like a kind of a gym cell. Not gonna lie, you know what I'm saying? It's like he really like.
Well, the more you
Yeah,
learn about him, the more that you learn about him. I mean, Mishima had this, like people that knew him in his personal life, like he was known for, say if you were to have a conversation with him, he wouldn't have a conversation with you unless he laid down the idea of, we're going to talk about this and this and this, and we can't deviate, because Mishima had this obsession. And it's funny because like Benicio, when you mention about ideology, this was a huge part of Mishima's lifestyle, in that it seemed as though he wanted to be the perfect man across the board, both aesthetically and even he wanted to like develop this perfect ideology. But in essence, he was also a man that had this dual lifestyle, and all of his novels, they're about his ideology, they're about personas, they're about people wearing masks. And he was someone, you know, who was very uncomfortable with his homosexuality. And when you read like any of his work, there's a lot of homoeroticism all throughout it. It's like idealized perfection of the male form of what a man is supposed to be. And he seemed as though he really struggled balancing that with this idea of, you know, the ancient samurai, this fall from grace of what Japan once was. I mean, in a modern thing, there is a lot of parallels between him and a gym cell, to be honest. I don't think that's like a crazy thing to say.
So then, why is it that like he could never see like a romance or a connection or a like? Is it just a matter of survivability? Is it just a matter of agency for the individual? Is it
I
like
mean,
the
I
is
mean,
yeah, yeah.
he's a complex individual that definitely had layers in which he was very uncomfortable showing his true self, and
Mhm.
even though at the same time what he did show was his absolute belief, I just think it's this fraught inner world of someone that never came to terms with who they truly were, even though at the same time it's kind of a dichotomy because what he put out there he also truly was. It was just especially within the realm of like Japanese society of this strict almost caste system that he wanted, and yet the world that he wanted he wouldn't have fit in with at all. Jay, you've been here for a while.
I think Forrest was here before. Forrest is, but I just want to add really quick
Go ahead.
that reading. I've never heard of Mishima or the book before, just neither. And then it was more interesting for me to read the biography. Somewhere in the middle of the book, I was like, okay, I think the context is gonna matter. So in the middle of the book, I read the biography. I'm like, oh yeah, it adds to the story. And I'll just quickly mention that I was fascinated by because it's everything you mentioned right now, like the multifaceted of like he was this and then at some point he was like dramatically changed to this and he was super ideologically driven. But then the book itself, I was kind of disappointed after reading the Blood Meridian and reading the Brave New World. Like one talks about ideology a lot, the other one talks about violence a lot. These books kind of didn't give me much. But there's a couple of interesting things we can talk and definitely different things that were not covered by previous book, but this book I was like, oh, after reading the other two, it's kind of disappointing book club, but
Fair enough.
so let's see how it's gonna go.
Fair enough. Forrest, how are you?
How you doing? You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Hey, Forrest.
Hi. So I'll start off by saying kind of like I knew who he was because I had seen the Schrader film before and parts of like his personality, but I had never actually read one of his works until this one. So I read this, and for such a short novel, it's actually it's quite dense with food for thought. You 100% get out a lot of that personality that you find in like his prolific sort of character. Like you're sort of talking about his obsession with death and the virtues of masculinity are kind of like that's like the big tragedy of the book. You said a word that reminded me the most of kind of the themes in the book the most, which is romanticism. He is a Japanese romantic through and through. I think it's kind of hard to connect to him subconsciously because we're so entrenched in sort of our Western virtues. But him in sort of like the Japanese like warrior male, he kind of like that's like you said what he wanted to embody. And I feel the Ryuji, the evolution of his life and his relationship to what's the mother's name? The woman that he gets with, Fukaso. So
Saka, yeah.
yeah,
Fusaku.
see Fusaku. I saw that as the Japanese romantic ideal settling down, giving up for someone that represents sort of a lifestyle that was post World War II Japan. Someone who's like more Western in nature, like her opinions. This is a common theme in Japanese art as well. Post World War II art is sort of the encroachment of this Western lifestyle on the Japanese romantic ideals. I mean, Miyazaki is sort of this obvious example just because there's so much nature versus technology, but I actually think an underrated example is something like Silent Hill, which people think of as like, or the fact that Japan has a bunch of invading alien like antagonists. People think Silent Hill is more of like a religious critical work, which it absolutely is. But I think also sort of like this fog and the industrialization of the town itself is also sort of this critical of Western influence on Japan sort of I mean, also the church itself could represent that as well. That's what I got the most out of it. I got this like, although I definitely see it also as this personal yearning, this romantic journey, exploration, destruction, imperfection, the struggle of life itself. It's super existential, but I saw a lot of that. The perversion of the struggle of our life, given that we want to settle. You know, we fall out of grace with the sea. We fall out of grace with nature and our relationship with it to go settle in these lives of passivity and westernness, I guess I would say, and that makes us disgusted, you know, without even knowing it, sort of. If you're catching my drift,
Yeah.
not no pun intended.
Yeah. It's that well,
Yeah.
funnily enough, it's because I was speaking, and if Louisa here, she would mention it, and she has a lot more insight on this than I do. But she was mentioning, you know, when she was reading through it, there's a lot of nuances about Japanese culture in terms of like the clothes that the mother dresses and whatnot. That as time
Yeah.
goes on, particularly when it comes back, the things that he notices is also like this dilution of Japanese culture. I mean, we can see like obvious ones where there's a point where Noboru, for instance, he loves Chinese food, and apparently the dress that the mother wears is a I can't remember how she fucking
Like
describes
even
it,
the way she
but
eats and stuff, you know.
yeah,
That,
yeah, and it's like, I mean, the thing is like with Mishima, this is what's so strange about reading his works, because I really do see this as like some pumped up fever dream that he must have had of how he viewed the world. Because I think, you know, in the opening scene when Noboru is peeping through the peephole, and the way it's described, as you said, Forrest, it's such a dense book, because everything that he writes, I find in the prose, it feels so saturated with this intense emotion that comes from him, that he says
yeah.
like, as he's in there watching his mother have sex, there's a connection between him and his mother, between Ryuji and the sea, between him and the universe, and it's all like as though everything has coalesced within the mind of this boy. And I think the phrase that he uses is something like, "If all this were to end at this moment, then the world would be destroyed." And it's just this level of intensity that he carries with him,
Yeah,
and
it's
that also
visceral emotion in the writing,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah, and I mean that's the same thing with like this nationalism of Japan, that even the idea of a young Japanese boy wanting to eat Chinese food, it's tantamount to heresy. It's like one of the worst sins a Japanese person could commit.
Yeah, and so
Go on,
that's
Joe.
why. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. What was I gonna say? I was thinking about like when I read like the first part of the book, and thinking like about like when you're like a teenager and you're like your body start developing hormones and how that changes just everything, how you just see the world, how you feel. Like that is so hard, like actually so hard, like to like describe. And so when I read this, like I was like, finally, yes, someone put in the words like something I thought was completely undescribable, and that was like really just satisfying to me, you know.
Oh, here's something. What does everyone think about like Noboru as a character? Do we find him sympathetic? Do we find him useless? Because there's also this idea that what is it? It says Noboru was convinced of his genius at a young age, and he is probably one of those children that is, you know, just slightly ahead, and the group with the cheap and whatnot, they probably are the more intellectual, but probably more outcast of the group. But do people find him sympathetic? Do people relate to him? What's the general consensus?
I found it the most annoying part that they talk about how they're a group of geniuses and then the mother and everybody else helps him with homework all the time. It was so fucking annoying. But yeah, I find it sympathetic because it's definitely not his fault. Like what I mentioned somewhere in the chat in the beginning, it always comes from parents and from the environment. The mother locking the door is definitely has something to do with him having the life like this. So like it's not normal, and it definitely has effects on the child when your mother locks you and stuff like this. And we don't know what was there with the dad, if that was good or bad or whatever, but I understand that it's coming from parents. It's not like child wakes up is like, oh, I'm gonna be a psycho. No, the child wakes up,
Yeah.
parents and society fucks them up, and then they find somebody like Chief who at least understands them and talk to them. And then they're like, okay, at least I'm gonna be with them because they give me attention, give me love, give me whatever I need. So they go and drift into these ways. So I think
I, I
it's
really like what you're saying there, because if you could just extrapolate that a little bit in a literary element, every time I see children, I'm thinking of it as analogous to the future generations.
Mhm.
So that's why I'm sympathetic to Noboru. I'm also kind of annoyed by his relationship with everybody about him and him being like this. But it reminds me of myself, like people commenting about how you're such a precocious child, but you grow up and realize you're just kind of normal, you know. But I do think that he's an insert, at least either unconsciously or purposefully. Who knows? You know, when writers write, he is an insert for the future of Japan that is battling out between sort of these romantic virtues and the changing world. And you know where is he going to find himself? He's abused by these people. He's embraced by these people. So of course he loves this and hates that. That's why I'm sympathetic towards him.
I related to him on purely he had some energy that he didn't fully have the perspective to really elaborate on. And he, basically through his insecurity gained some haughty right to rage at the world. Very adolescent, very archetypically adolescent, and I think that's why it resonated with me so much. Is that on some level you have to understand, Noboru just had ambitions, and he wanted to portray them onto the world, and that's very like well thought out in the book and how that actually plays out. So I like you can fully understand it happening even at the end when I was confused as to why he was doing that. Like I felt the journey. That was the most important thing. I felt Noboru. I wanted to ask Forrest to expand on something, but specifically, you mentioned how like uh post-modernity specifically gets you to accustom yourself to a life that you subconsciously you're disgusted by. And I was gonna ask if you could explain that and if you saw any parallels in the book or like what you meant or what exactly are you pointing to there?
Well, what was the last time we talked about that? I just
Right.
I don't think it
Yeah.
wouldn't be postmodernity itself. I would say that
It would
the
be like
postmodern era that we live in has created a sort of not to get off topic from the book, but it was relating to, I think one time we had spoken about sort of the declination of art in the world, and I was like reminded of this Radiohead quote that you guys talked, not Tom York quote that forgot what he said. He said something that that the youth, what was it, that they're so self-centered, which by the way narcissism is a big theme
That they so
in the book as well.
self-centered that they have no interiority. Something like
Something
that.
like that.
I think
was along the
Louis
lines there.
quoted that in the Nothing Spunk Anymore video.
I think so too. I think that's what it was. And that to me is an effect of the cynicism of the postmodern, of like this idea that with the not only nothing being original, or the idea that nothing is original, but the recreations and the spurning of that, and then the cynicism regarding these recreations, and it creates a dullness in the quest for not even just meaning, because that might even be too far, but the quest for like being captivated by something. And so I think it turns people who may be weaker to kind of what Tom York was saying, reject even the idea of exploration. And I do, maybe not that exactly, but I do find uh, uh, a narcissism in Noboru in this book, kind of, if that's what you were getting on, a rejection to feel pain and to want to feel comfortable, even though, and I feel like he's an insert for Mishima as well, and not just talking about the future of Japan, because if you know, the little context I even have about Mishima, he's a guy that seems to kind of be full of contradictions, but like wears them. And I think that's true of most people. Most people are filled with that's a very Freudian concept, like where our anxiety comes from, but that we're full of contradictions, and the ones that we ignore are kind of like make our personality, so to speak, or our opinions, and what makes us uneasy, what makes us curva, like curved, queer. But he's a guy who kind of like he wrote openly about his contradictions, not even intentionally, right? Just intuitively, and it's fascinating. It reminds me of a very good character that people I think relate to that is someone like Travis Bickle or Raskolnikov. Those are characters that their contradictions are on the screen or in the text. But they're there for play. They're kind of there to relate to in one way or another to learn more about ourselves. I think Mishima is a good example of someone who's like that.
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think the way that you said it there was that he's not speaking about them knowingly, but he's doing it intuitively. I think that's like a perfect descriptor of him himself. Because I think, Jay, when you mentioned like how all of this is related to the parents, it feels to me that the lens of which Mishima actually writes about it in the book, he puts it there, but it seems almost like it's in a passing glance. I don't think that Mishima himself actually realizes the impact of that himself, because his world is so insular. Because he's like Noboru in that he rejects natural feeling, but he's forcing it to exist when it doesn't actually exist. Like at the end of the novel, Noboru he has like a slight hesitation in wanting to actually engage in the murder of Ryuji. There is still something there, but he will go through with it. And it's funny actually, like George said, the chief is like a petty Judge Holden, which also makes sense because then Noboru is also like the kid, in which that ultimately what he is a bit of a blank slate, and he just has these external forces acting upon him. But when he doesn't have this structure around him that he's able to curate what these forces are, they just happen to him, and he just kind of acts on them intuitively. And I think this is the thing about Mishima, because what I find about it is that throughout the novel there is a bit of a balance where I can see how Ryuji and Noboru seem to be the flip sides of the coin for who Mishima is as a person, this innate dichotomy of I want the romantic, I want the longing, I want the stoicism, I want these things that don't act within one another. I want to be contradictory. But by the end, I find that his depiction, the way that he portrays Ryuji as just like longingly gazing off into the distance while these forces are literally acting upon him, while these children are getting ready for his murder, and he's just kind of daydreaming. He comes across as a bit of a hopeless figure, one that he isn't attuned for glory in the way that I think that Mishima is so obsessive with. I think that as a person and in his novel, he shows that there is a bit of a pitiful aspect to the fact that Ryuji, all he is a father and a family man. He has no glorifying attributes to him. He's just a normal guy.
He's not even like a father who, as they kind of talk about that all the fathers are fucked, but he's not even a father who made a child. He just fathered to somebody else's child. It's even less.
Yeah. But that's like what you said as well, where even like, because we're talking about parents and whatnot, even what his status is, what his archetype is of a father, these again are just external forces that are kind of just thrown on him, and he just has to accept it and make a life out of that.
Yes.
Go on, George.
Okay, so like I think it was like the third last chapter where Fusako discovers that her kid is just constantly spying on her and Ryuji having sex, and then of course Ryuji tries to be like be the father that now he is, and instead of like there's a desire in Noboru that he wants to be punished, like because that will like reaffirm his image of Ryuji as a badass man, And then,
Yeah.
but no, like Ryuji is just, he tries to be like understanding and nice and compassionate, and that destroys Noboru. Like destroys Noboru, makes me even like that puts him on like the path to kill him alongside like his friends.
But
And that's like
the thing
that
as
is
well, isn't it?
fascinating.
That's the thing as well, because it feels as though all the way throughout that even as a reader, the way that Mishima's writing, you're kind of like you want this retribution from Ryuji, as though to like capture some sense of glory, as though to capture some sense of agency of his own, that in a way he should beat Noboru. It's a very strange perspective that Mishima has with it. And I do also think, and this may be controversial, but I don't think it's that controversial, I do also think that this desire to be beaten is also a fetishistic lens that Mishima is inserted in the novel. I think the idea of inflicting pain upon himself is something that sexually excites Mishima as a writer.
Ooh.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, I
that's
agree.
no
It's
problem.
also because it's also a bit of you don't take accountability for your actions or stuff like this. You don't have to decide. You don't have to think. You don't have to face it. You don't have to do something better, or you don't have to think too much. Let's just say, to bring the previous point, somebody just beats you up and like, okay, that's it, that's settled. Like I paid, I did my actions and I paid for them. That's it. I don't have to do anything else. So it's really easy excuse. And if you do it for your whole life, you don't have to take actions for stuff. You're just like, oh, fetishism into all of this, and that's it. And you try to change something, and then at the end you maybe like, okay, I tried to do coup, it didn't work, I'll just kill myself, and that's my glory. I'm gonna go at the pride, at the glory, and everybody's gonna talk about this, and they're gonna talk that I didn't do anything well, and it's kind of like easy exit, I would say.
He did live his truth in that aspect.
He did.
Like,
Yeah, but
like
he's
what
just,
you were
you
saying.
cannot. After
Go
that,
ahead.
you cannot do anything, right? Like if your truth is quickly like, okay, I killed myself. That's my truth, and you cannot face it. It's like if you argue with somebody, like, oh, I'm living the God, everything that God tells me, I'm doing it, and you cannot argue with this. This is just like a
I
dot.
feel
That's
like
it. You cannot say
in
anything.
his mind, exemplifying his truth in that way would like captivate other people. Obviously, that's not the way it worked out, but he, yeah, he did when he took over the government building and people weren't really vibing with everything, and he was gonna lose. He axed him. He did it seppuku style.
That's
He-
a very accurate way of describing how that went down, because it wasn't like this catastrophic thing. People
No,
just
it
ultimately
wasn't.
didn't vibe with what was going on.
Yeah, exactly. People kind of just didn't care.
It just
It was
sadly
a nothing burger.
deflated, didn't it?
Yeah.
It's like it's so strange to. I mean, this is interesting. This is like not related to the book or anything, but just to know like the kind of the status that Mishima had. There was a competition once in Japan
The Mifune poll.
of
Yeah.
the most attractive man in Japan, and Toshiro Mifune came second, and Mishima came first, which I'm sure he loved.
Yeah. Interesting.
Can you
I like-
believe?
I mean,
Yeah.
go on,
Go ahead.
go on.
Oh no, I was gonna say, do any of you know there was a BBC adaptation in the 70s of this book?
Yeah, I saw
Yes.
when I would look
It
it up,
took
I would
place
see
in
it
the UK.
online.
Yeah, it's Chris Christopherson. That
Yeah.
blew my mind.
Yeah, it is.
There's a new wave adaptation. Or, yeah.
I haven't seen it. I'm kind of curious from it, just from a perspective, because I think that you take the story and you put it in England. I think
I
it's
feel
a
like it doesn't
completely
work.
different story.
I feel like that doesn't
Exactly,
work.
yeah.
When I was looking at it, I'm like, the movie, the romanticism is so unique to the nation and history of Japan that it's like there's no analog in the West. It's funny because
Yeah.
like not to change the topic so quickly, but also while I was reading this, just because romanticism and love, and I guess the sin of the love at all, I could not read it without thinking of Faust as like a good double thing. Not because Faust is anything really like it, which is the good part. It's because Faust is the romantic Western piece. You know what I mean? And Faust
Yeah.
also deals with a character who's quite narcissistic, who desires things, who's afraid of the future, but who is the ultimate rationalist, who learns to find his love, and it deals with sex and parenthood and the death of the child as opposed to the father. As spoiler alert, I don't know if anybody's. Hey, watch the Murnau Faust. You'll like it. Trust me, it's one of my favorite movies. But and read part one. But it also deals with sort of obviously the ending of Faust is a little it deals with death as well, but it's a little happier. And it's like I love seeing Faust in this way because I'm like, ooh, Faust is kind of like if you took that story and you put the Christianity in it, you get Faust. And you take Faust, you take the Christianity out, and you put Japanese nationalism in it, or maybe nationalism isn't the right word, but Japanese romanticism rather in it. You get characters, maybe not stories, but characters like the ones you get in this. So you understanding what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, like, it's a weird one to tackle because all the thematics are there, but actually, Jay mentioned like in the chat. I think that's actually a better way to say it. In that, I don't think Mishima. I think you're right. I don't think he did write intuitively. I think it is thoughtlessly. I think it's just. I think he was so insular in his world that we read it as people that are able to look at other perspectives. But I think that Mishima's lack of capacity to see beyond his perspective is why things are in there that I don't even think that he ultimately recognized within himself. Hi, Leo.
Hi, Leo.
But it's like for instance, like there's I think it's Kyoko's House, which is one of the films that is shown in the Paul Schrader film. And if you read that one, knowing and like if you read it in tandem with this as well, and then knowing how his life ended, I mean like that's a story of this guy. I mean it's like interconnected stories, but it's of these like young men, and it's about an author who he has an athletic side where he's like a boxer, and then he has this artistic side as well where he's a painter and whatnot. And then what he does, he has like this sadomasochistic relationship with a woman in which he goes to her so that she can inflict pain on him, so that she can cut him and carve him up, and ultimately end in his suicide. And it's this erotic novel that Mishima has that it's so hard to separate his work from fantasy, even though like what you're saying with it does work as a Faustian novel, but I think that just happens fortuitously. I think that the draw to Mishima's writing is that it's so intense, and I don't even think he fully grasps why it is. He's just, as you said, he's living his truth, even though his truth may not be beneficial for him or the Japanese nation, but it is his truth to a degree.
Yeah. The profound emotion in the writing is the essence. That's why he's able to sort of, I think, thoughtlessly paint the pages with this story. And a lot of the greatest written works, including film, they say that thought is the enemy of flow. And so a lot of some of the best works that were ever written. One of the ones that I was watching the other day, one of my favorite movies, which is Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, by Mike Nichols, which is an excellent film. But it's like that movie, people extrapolate so much about the game and the relationship between these people.
Yeah.
But what it really comes down to, and I think even Edward Albee says this himself, is that it's just the characters experiencing emotions. It's just writing about the way that these characters might feel as an analog for what you feel. And oftentimes that's the flow of writing. He's not thinking about our grand pieces with subtext within subtext and plot within plot to say this and that. He writes the feelings, and that comes naturally. Because it even reminds me of David Lynch too. That's what Catching the Big Fish ultimately is.
Yeah. In the sense that the ideas are there within you, and it is kind of that instinct to grab onto them. I do feel like that is a valid form of writing also, because some people would say, oh, but stream of consciousness, because there's no intellectualizing behind it, so surely there can be no meaning because the author didn't imbue a meaning into it. But I think you know, it's a cliche, but in a way you can say, you know, writing from the heart, we carry enough stuff with us that inevitably something is going to emerge if you do just rely on your instinct.
I agree, and I find that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think like this combination of like just like just like refined intellect and like raw emotion. That's where like great art comes from. I put this quote on the chat like of being like a great novel is smarter than its author, and it's that like your like you've been like intelligent and all, but your intuition just going just a little above it and like creating something greater than the sum of its parts.
Jay, I'm curious actually, like, sorry, I was just gonna say, Jay, I'm curious because you're saying like I get, and I actually kind of agree that maybe like the most interesting part of the novel is relating it to Mishima himself. But would you say that, like, can you read the novel without that, and do you think that it's a success, or do you think that it's a failure of a novel? Do you think that like that's the only way that it can be read?
I think you can read it. I think the first part has a lot of beautiful metaphors and a lot of beautiful writing by itself. Like when he describes I enters the room and he describes the curtains and stuff like this. Just by itself, it's already beautiful. And I think it's this part of it is really nice. And talking about the sea and how like even the stuff like oh a woman's body is like a beach or coast and shit like this. It's kind of interesting by itself, but the whole violence and it's not well developed to me. Like the whole to me when I first read it, when I started reading it, I read the first 3 chapters like why why Luis is making us read this, and then I saw Leo's comment about like oh how could you do this? I'm like okay something's gonna happen. So then I read fourth or third chapter where stuff starting to happen. I'm like okay I see, and then by the end I read it. To me, it felt like he wrote this romantic novel with a bit of maybe this peephole accident or a bit of this exploration of father and son. And then he was like, this is boring. Let me add this crazy chief and this gang. And so he added 3 chapters in between. So that's how it felt. So if without these 3 chapters, it would be a whole different thing and it would be nice by itself. But these 3 chapters are 2 chapters where the kids talk about nihilism and life and all of this. They don't work for me by themselves without the knowing the author.
Yeah.
Can I add something to this?
Yeah, of course.
Like I said, I've read Mishima like for the first time, and to me, by the end, it seemed like the novel was about everything that he wrote made sense to me by the end, because I felt like it was about a kind of true dialectical struggle, or maybe even like the erasure of this internal conflict in favor of some extreme inhuman purity. Because by the end of the book, Noboru kills Ryujui. It's not depicted, it's not described, but it's left to imagination. And so even the violent parts make sense, because it kind of reflects this internal struggle.
That's interesting actually. It's interesting like both perspectives, because I think it is quite interesting in the structure of the novel that it is like 75%. It does feel like a traditional romance novel, and the violence does just kind of emerge. And there is the sequence with the cat, which is like this strange explosion of violence out of nowhere. And then there is this kind of bubbling, this murmuring with the chief and the crew. And the violence at the end, again, it's only insinuated. But see, because I actually find it I do find it a very violent novel. And I don't know if people share that sentiment, but I feel like because there's such a dissatisfaction from the author's perspective of the world, that it emanates with this almost disgust that he has with the state of Japan, and ultimately, in that case, the state of the world. And that finale seems so hopeless to me, and I think it probably does feel more hopeless because we don't even get the redemptive act of the violence in and of itself. Whereas, you know, the one thing that Ryuji may have had in the eyes of Noboru earlier was this act of violence that he could have, you know, in Noboru's eyes, redeemed some grand cause for Japan. And yet, at the end, what they all do is like the reason that they commit that act in the finale is because they're all about to turn 14. So by the law of the land, they won't have anything. They still have the freedom to do it. And then once they turn 14, they no longer have this freedom, and so everything becomes pointless again. And it just I can't escape the fact that like Mishima, that he has this fatalist view that ultimately, no matter like how much he's able to beautify things, and he does find things beautiful, ultimately there is just this inevitable fall into hopelessness, into fatalism, and ultimately into death, that we're all going to we can only be redeemed by death, and that everything is tied to this. It's imbued in every single facet of society, and if you don't view the world like that, then you're not even alive at all. You're not even existing.
But then I ask that Mishima had did Mishima have had some kind of utopia in his mind, like in contrast to
the past, the emperors and samurai and all of that.
It's like, but the thing is that even the way that he approaches that, it's as though like he knows that it can't happen. I mean, even if you look at the footage of him taking over, it's kind of comical, really. I don't think he deep down knew that, you know, he could actually cause a revolution. It's just like it's this pipe dream that he has. I think that he may like be able to craft an idea of a utopia in his mind, but I think that ultimately he knows that it's unachievable. I just think that he has an ideology that is doomed to fail, but he also knows that, which is strange in and of itself.
Yeah. I think his obsession with death is also that's also something that's sort of it's a huge part of him when you first get to learn about him. And I think that's why ultimately the end, the sort of the fate of Ryuji, especially if you feel Ryuji is sort of like I do, this idea of the past, of the spirit of Japan, of the romantic virtues of the Japanese, and it's dead. It's even like people, these thoughts die and are all, we're all connected. Kind of like you said, if you're not thinking existentially, well, then you're not living at all. You're already dead, so to speak. He found like a curious beauty in it, in sort of like someone trapped in time, especially young people killed, like warriors and stuff. It reminds you of like Norsemen and stuff, and their obsession with Valhalla and dying in battle, and it being like the ultimate expression of their culture.
Yeah, I think that he has this this wanton longing for being part of a culture or a time wherein you are expected to die, because I think I think that way life allows you, or life forces upon you, that you don't have to make a decision, and that kind of goes hand in hand with how Mishima lives his life, because then he wouldn't have to worry about all of these contradictions. He wouldn't have to worry about all of these things happening, that he would have to make a decision on: how do I portray myself? Who am I, the self? Because if ultimately all I'm going to do is go to battle and die and be glorified, then that will be who I am for eternity. I will live through the ages. But I mean, you can also say that, like, in a developing technological society, which he was also against, he has to contend with even more factors that are out of his control, that's trying to decipher who he is, and this is like the biggest fear for Mishima himself. Whereas again, like you say, like if I'm a Norseman, I rock up to a village and whatever happens. Someone's going to die, and eventually I will. It's just such a simpler life, which is more attuned to Mishima. And I suppose in like this a much more detached way, it is a life that can be envied by people. A much more simplistic way of living and dying.
I agree. I think that's the appeal of the romantic today in general. I don't know about 100, 120 years ago, but right now, I think most of us agree in the West, there's a bit of a crisis of meaning. There's like a lot of people don't feel like they're doing things that matter. They don't feel like they're part of a community. And part of what it is that people want to make decisions. People want to at least feel like they have the choice to make decisions and that they're making the right decisions or like learning from making the wrong decisions. And I do think that I conceptualize this romantic yearning as giving you the meaning to make the decision, and to die for that is meaningful. So you've solved that crisis of meaning. It's more important that way. I think he's kind of like, he was ahead of the curve on and I either unconsciously or consciously, just like kind of what I started with my first things, that the West's sort of I guess you could call it death of godism, but it might just be the West in general. Their encroachment on the Japanese was gonna bring this about, or at least he felt this coming. And I think that's a common thing in the Japanese sort of zeitgeist.
Yeah.
It's again like why they experience like alien invasions and stuff in their art. Go ahead.
I mean, like you've got to think even like in just in the relation of him, like Mishima, when Japan surrendered, he was 20 years old. So like in the prime of his development, he sees the Japanese empire, this great empire that could never be defeated. He sees it surrender to the United States of America, and then sees the occupation. And it's like this is a completely this is a shit analogy, but the only thing I can compare it to is, the guy that made Temple OS, what's his name? The fucking, oh my god, someone knows his name. But if people don't know, Terry Davis, yeah. So if people don't know, Terry Davis, he's the world's greatest computer programmer, and he's also schizophrenic. And there is a fascinating piece of footage of him. He lived in Las Vegas, and he's walking along like streaming, and he's just like bugged out in his eyes, just like chatting to these voices in his head. And then he's in the vicinity of the Las Vegas shooting from the Mandalay Bay Hotel. And I just imagine, can you imagine a schizophrenic person being in the vicinity of something like this going on? And the analogy that I'm making is, now imagine that you are Yukio Mishima, you are absolutely obsessed to an unhealthy degree with the reclaiming of the great Japanese nationalism. At the same time, you're trying to be a samurai yourself, and you're contending with your homosexuality. You are obsessed with this you are obsessed with your own aesthetic and the aesthetic of others. And then all of a sudden, like that, nuclear bombs go off around you, and that empire that you believed in, that you built your life around in trusting, collapses and is taken over by the United States of America. Judging from his writing, I'm inclined to believe that the way that he viewed that, I can't quite put into words, because I think that there would be an intensity with how he views these small actions, that something so like such a societal, such a paradigm shifting moment, I don't think even he could comprehend. I don't think he could ever come to terms with it.
Yeah, that was like a common feeling amongst the Japanese at the time. I mean, we all hear the stories and the reputation of their desire to not surrender and for total war. And but also what's important is that the emperor, I'm sure you've heard this before, was like a quasi-religious figure. And so to see the emperor surrendering was like it's like it's like God surrendering, you know.
Yeah.
And so the way that I can't even imagine. I wish I was like there afterwards, not before the bombs. I wish I was there to like witness what that does to a cultural unconscious. You know, we think of
Yeah.
the cultural unconscious of the Germans turning on people as so fascinating, but it's like imagine the critical moment of your religion being defeated. You know, like
and not even
yeah.
that, but being defeated by someone, and then they assimilate with you, and you look up to them, and in your day-to-day activity, you're like, oh yeah, we can play baseball, why not? And it's just like this slow, almost like milk toast acceptance of it, which there's so, I mean, there's so much in Mishima, and even like in the Japanese subconscious, in which, if you look at like the like far right groups in Japan now that exist, they basically like preach what Mishima was preaching and whatnot, and they still want, no, one day the great emperor will return and all will be well with Japan. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. It's very interesting if you can see some protests from far right Japanese groups. They, again, like Mishima, they do believe it. They do live what they preach.
I imagine if Mishima was still around for the 90s in Japan, where you see Japan become like the second largest economy in the world by the 1980s, and
Yeah.
just like a period. What is it? They have a name for the period for like basically the Japanese.
It's like a bubble, it's something bubble or something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's something like that. Not the Asian bubble, but the Japanese. I think because they named their eras after the certain emperor, and basically
Yeah.
from 1969 to like 1990, like the good years that everybody's nostalgic for, has a name. I don't want to say it was the Showa. It was something like that. They have a name for it. But like, can you imagine if he was here for that, to see Japan rise to be the great Asian tiger, and then just like, it crashed. Japan was so big that it crashed so hard, and it was still like the third largest economy in the world. Like, so it was like, but you've seen Peppermint Candy, right? Go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, like, I just imagine him because of like what an intense figure he was. I could see him like really trying to ride that wave and saying, "Okay, we're nearly there. Now we just need to get to number one." And he probably, to be honest, if he was around, he probably would have done another coup, and it probably would have gone the same.
Yeah, probably. It's just Japan. I always see Japan like, how Japan. We used to make fun of Hikikomorism, right? Like, welcome to the NHK, like 15 years ago, when it was like a phenomenon in Japan. I feel like Japan is like, and Japan had its economic, it had a debt deflation crisis, 15 years before we had our Great Recession, which we recovered from, to be fair, but so did Japan. But the point is that nothing was ever the same again. But the thing is that I feel like Japan culturally is like 15 years ahead of us. I think it's because of their relationship to technology and where they are as a society. It's like nowadays we're struggling with our hikikomoris. We just call them, we call them incels and stuff, and Japan is on a population crunch, and a really bad one, which is kind of like putting in society at crisis as well. And the evolution of their culture, I feel like at least America, maybe not the West, but America catches up to it. I see the pattern coming, and Japan is kind of at the forefront first.
Well, there's something interesting. I remember Louisa told me about this not too long ago, and I thought there's no way this can be true. So basically, there was an era of like, it was known like in the 90s. It was like Cool Britannia was kind of like a thing in which, like, there was the Manchester bands and everything, and there was like kind of this resurgence that occurred of like UK culture that came, and the last time I did that was like during the mod culture, and apparently in around 2010. the Japanese government, they actually came up with this initiative in which they wanted to like spread the soft power of Japan through culture and whatnot. And so the Japanese government came forward and they established this idea that they want to spread across the world, like actively spread across the world, that Japan is cool. And they wanted to do that through whether it was through anime and manga, and they just wanted it to infiltrate Western culture so that it could be perceived as cool. And I can't imagine that this was, I mean, I can't imagine like any Western country or even any other Eastern country at the minute that would actively decide to do that, but not only decide to do it, but also be relatively successful in doing it and having a grasp on what a cool culture is. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, but what about Hollywood in the golden age and even a bit now and past some point? Like everybody loves US, everybody loves California because of the Hollywood and the images they were
Yeah.
portraying for a while. And now it's
I think
switched
we're
to
the
anime.
model. We're like the model of soft power, basically.
Yeah, and then
Go ahead.
and now it's anime and manga. Sorry, I'm just getting interrupted, so
Go
I
ahead.
couldn't hear you
Sorry.
telling. You can continue.
I was just you'd be surprised how many of those initiatives are like are purposefully like government oriented. Like I think K-pop was also something like that. That it was like a desire for Korean soft power, which 2022 was the year of
Hallyu
Korea.
wave. Yeah, the Hallyu
Yeah.
wave.
And I think also Spain. So when Spain like won the World Cups and like Rafael Nadal and the Euro Cup and stuff, Spain had an initiative to like for soft power through sports, and they invested a lot of money into their youth sports programs, and it turned into them having like some of the greatest international players ever. But it's funny, you'd be surprised where that a lot of this stuff it comes through an initiative for soft power. I wonder how many of those fail, but yeah, I have heard sort of like both Korea and Japan in 2010 were kind of like, and that's why those like especially shonen anime being exponentially more popular now, and in Korea, K-pop developing ever since 2010, it comes from like a real deliberate initiative to spread soft power.
I have a question. What does soft power translate to, like practically?
So hard power means like enforcing through violence, like exercising your power through like threats of military action. You're forcing a country to do something with the application of violence. Soft power is like cultural victory in civilization. Probably the biggest soft power wins of all time are like Hollywood and American pop music being everywhere.
But like what I mean, well, I understand that much, but like, why have soft power?
Because soft power has been, I think, its largest success historically is Eastern Europe, and the idea that like basically the United States got the Warsaw Pact, the former Warsaw Pact, especially from the 90s, to embrace its sphere of influence. Just off, it's probably because the Soviets were so horrible, but like just off the idea that the American way of life, liberalism, their global trade, and their types of governments were cool. They were better. We have Hollywood movies. People live free, burgers, French fries. And like so, soft power is actually. It's an incredibly powerful tool. Number one, your enemies are always going to use hard power as propaganda against you. They're going to convince you of being a colonizer, of an imperialist, of an empire. And it's probably a lot cheaper than like, it probably feels better,
Yeah, it also brings it back to
the, Go ahead.
Brings it back to the Brave New World conversation. Like he talks about soft power like inside the country. Like you have a country, everybody runs around being happy and not the tyrannic government. But this is kind of more on the global level. It's not just inside your country, but also to other countries and other cultures. You spread your beliefs, values, and all this stuff through not through power, not through conquering, not through like Christianity, but through anime, memes, movies, and so on. And then
It's
people buy
also,
into it, and then you use that power into other things.
you mentioned something that reminded me of something too. Just something that I think is fascinating that might relate. I think it's also in the subconscious of Mishima in this story. I think it's also what you find in Silent Hill as my analogy before, or the aliens in Japanese art. But it's like that Japan is super not Christian. Like, if there's one thing that they did reject from like U.S. influence is that Japan is really, really not Christian. They had, and I mean, obviously, Meiji Japan actively, if you've ever seen Samurai Champloo or Silence by Martin Scorsese, like actively persecuted the fuck out of Christians. But yeah, they think Christians are icky and dumb, like, and that's just, it's always something interesting to me because then it's also Korea, and I can't talk about one without the other. I think, like in terms of the latter half of the 20th century, and while I don't think Korea is majority Christian, it's quite Christian. But Korean churches are they're less than 100 years old. They're super evangelical and they're kind of weird. You know what I mean? They have messiahs everywhere.
It's a really interesting one because like Korean Christianity is growing quite a lot, and even like Catholicism in Korea is growing quite a lot also. And I find that very interesting because a lot of them, like you say, like there's a lot of Catholic churches that are made in like the last 50 years or whatever. And I don't think it is the majority, but it's a large amount.
Yeah, it's taking over there, and the thing is, the churches, they are. You have stuff like Moonies are a good example. That Moonies, what is it called? Like Shoinji or whatever. That a lot of these churches have messiahs that lead them. It's like a mega church plus one. They have people claiming to be God, but it's like it's popular. They're using
like they have like it's like filled with mega churches, but they have like I think it's something like 1 million plus members, and they gather each year to marry.
Yeah, the Moonies that he weds the members, and he's since died, but there are so many baby Moonies that came out of that.
Well, I think on that note, considering we haven't spoke about Mishima for like the last 10 minutes, I think we can cut the book club short if we want, and we can just go in the chat room and just chill and talk about whatever.
Okay. I'm down.
Let's we can move everyone. Let's all migrate over to the other room.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for recording as well, by the way, Esteban. We can all just move over to the next hangout and go join
Let's
Leo.
go.